Jim was in the middle of a conversation with Jimi Hendrix backstage at the Monterey Pop Festival when he suddenly leaned close and whispered 3 words that made Hendrix's face go white. What happened next left Jimi Hendrix refusing to take the stage for 30 minutes, shaken by what Morrison had said. It was June 18, 1967. The backstage area at Monterey County Fairgrounds was chaos, packed with musicians waiting to perform. The festival had already seen incredible sets from The Who, Janis Joplin, and Otis Redding. The Doors had finished their performance an hour earlier, tearing through, Break On Through, Light My Fire, and The End with Morrison at his shamanic peak. The crowd was still buzzing. Hendrix was scheduled next, preparing to close the festival with his guitar-burning finale. But what none of them knew was that in the corner of the backstage tent, 20 feet from where roadies were setting up Hendrix's amplifiers, Morrison had been drinking whiskey and talking about death for the past hour. The 3 words Morrison whispered to Hendrix were overheard by Roadie Michael Jeffries, 22, who was standing close enough to catch them. Michael had been working festivals all summer, but what he heard that night haunted him for decades. He'd lost his brother Thomas to suicide 3 months earlier and was barely holding himself together, taking this job to escape his family home in San Francisco, where grief was suffocating him. "We're already dead," Michael heard Morrison whisper to Hendrix, his voice carrying certainty that made the words feel like prophecy. 4 years later, both men would be gone at 27, and Michael would spend his life wondering if Jim Morrison had somehow known their fates that night in Monterey. Before we continue this story, if you want more untold stories about Jim Morrison and the Doors, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the mysteries that changed rock and roll forever. The Monterey International Pop Festival in June 1967 was the moment when counterculture went mainstream, predating Woodstock by 2 years. The Doors were riding the success of Light My Fire, which had hit #1 just weeks earlier, while Jimi Hendrix was still relatively unknown in America, despite being huge in England. Both men were at pivotal moments in their careers. Both carried darkness that fame was amplifying, and both were drinking heavily backstage as the festival reached its climax. Morrison and Hendrix had crossed paths before in Los Angeles clubs, but Monterey was the first time they'd really talked. The Doors had performed late afternoon, and Morrison's set had been intense even by his standards. He'd been drinking since morning, had taken acid at some point, and his performance of The End stretched to nearly 15 minutes, Morrison going deep into the audible section, his voice raw and frightening. When he came off stage, he was sweating through his leather pants, his eyes unfocused in a way that suggested he'd gone somewhere during the performance and hadn't fully come back. Hendrix was scheduled to close the festival at midnight, nervous about following The Who's instrument-destroying set. He was backstage tuning his guitar, drinking wine, when Morrison appeared beside him. According to multiple witnesses, Morrison sat down heavily on an equipment case and started talking without introduction, launched into a monologue about death and fame and the trap they were both caught in. He talked about feeling like he was disappearing into the Jim Morrison persona, like the real person was being eroded by the performance, like fame was a kind of death that happened while you were still breathing. Hendrix listened, kept tuning his guitar, the two of them creating a pocket of intensity in the middle of backstage chaos. Morrison talked for 20 minutes about the highway incident from his childhood, about believing he carried the spirit of a dead man, about shamanism and possession, and the blurred line between channeling darkness and being consumed by it. Then, according to Roadie Michael Jeffries, Morrison leaned toward Hendrix and lowered his voice to a whisper. "We're already dead." Not a question, not a metaphor, but a statement delivered with absolute conviction. Michael watched Hendrix's reaction, saw his face change, saw him stop tuning his guitar mid-note and sit completely still. Then Hendrix stood up abruptly and walked away without speaking. The 3 words hit Hendrix like Morrison had reached inside him and touched something he'd been trying not to acknowledge. For the next 30 minutes, while festival organizers were trying to get Hendrix on stage, Jimi was sitting alone in a corner, staring at nothing. His manager Chaz Chandler tried to talk to him, but Hendrix just kept shaking his head, saying he needed a minute. What Morrison had articulated was something Hendrix had been feeling but couldn't name. The sensation that success was killing something essential, that fame was a death sentence disguised as achievement. Eventually, after 30 minutes, Hendrix agreed to take the stage. But his energy was different than planned. He'd been intending a triumphant, joyful set, but what he delivered was darker, more aggressive. When he set his guitar on fire during Wild Thing, witnesses said it felt less like performance art and more like ritual sacrifice. He smashed the burning guitar into the stage and walked off without encore, leaving the crowd stunned. Backstage after his performance, Hendrix looked for Morrison, but Jim had already left. Hendrix told those close to him that Morrison had said something that shook him, that made him reconsider everything. He didn't repeat the 3 words to most people, but the impact was visible. Looking back from knowing both men died at 27, Morrison's 3 words take on prophetic weight. In June 1967, Morrison was 23, and Hendrix was 24. They both had roughly 4 years left. Whether Morrison had genuine premonition or was expressing existential dread that happened to prove accurate, the statement became part of mythology surrounding both artists and the cursed 27 Club. Morrison seemed to carry awareness of early death from early in his career, talked about not expecting to live past 30, wrote poetry obsessed with mortality. Whether his certainty influenced his behavior, whether he unconsciously moved toward the fate he predicted, remains speculation. But the fact that he expressed this certainty to Hendrix, another artist who would die at 27, creates eerie resonance. Hendrix died on September 18, 1970, in London, choking on vomit after consuming sleeping pills and wine. He was 27, at the height of his fame. Less than a year later, on July 3, 1971, Jim Morrison was found dead in a Paris bathtub at 27. The 2 deaths, separated by less than 10 months, cemented the 27 Club legend and gave Morrison's backstage warning an almost supernatural quality. Beyond the coincidence of their ages at death, Morrison and Hendrix shared deeper connections. Both were artists who used altered consciousness as creative tool and escape mechanism. Both struggled with the performance of identity that fame demanded. Both felt trapped by the personas they'd created. Morrison had the Lizard King, Hendrix had the Guitar God. Both masks were exhausting to maintain. Both required substances to sustain. Both were slowly killing the actual people underneath. They also shared similar family backgrounds. Morrison's father was Admiral George Morrison, military authority who demanded conventional success, whose rejection created wounds that never healed. Hendrix's father, Al Hendrix, struggled with alcohol and provided unstable childhood. Both artists were running from fathers, from expectations, from versions of masculinity they couldn't embody. The darkness Morrison referenced wasn't just philosophy or posturing. It was recognition of actual self-destructive patterns both men were deep into. Morrison's alcoholism was already severe by 1967, his behavior increasingly erratic. Hendrix's drug use was escalating beyond recreational into necessary. Both were surrounded by enablers, by people who benefited from their genius and had little incentive to interrupt patterns producing brilliant art and massive profit. Morrison telling Hendrix, "We're already dead," was acknowledgement they were both on trajectories they couldn't escape. Michael Jeffries carried that moment for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, he described the encounter with haunted detail. He'd been standing close enough to hear Morrison's whisper, close enough to see Hendrix's face change. Michael said it looked like Hendrix had been struck physically, though no contact was made beyond the whisper. What made the moment particularly affecting for Michael was his own proximity to death. His brother Thomas had killed himself 3 months earlier. Being at Monterey was supposed to be healing, but hearing Morrison talk about death with such casual certainty brought Michael's trauma rushing back. In the years after, as both Morrison and Hendrix died young, Michael wondered if he should have intervened, should have tried to shake both men out of the death acceptance that had settled over them. But he'd been 22, grieving, and the idea of intervening seemed impossible. After Monterey, Morrison and Hendrix's paths crossed occasionally, but they never had another conversation as intense. Both were increasingly consumed by their careers and demons. When Hendrix died in September 1970, Morrison was in Los Angeles. According to people close to Jim, he took the news hard, got extremely drunk, talked about the 27 Club curse, even though it wasn't called that yet. He referenced their Monterey conversation, said Hendrix proved him right. Pamela Corson later told friends that Morrison became obsessed with 27 after Hendrix's death, seemed resigned to dying when he reached that age. In the decade since both men died, the story of Morrison's 3 words has grown into rock and roll legend. Some versions have Morrison saying different words, but the core remains. Morrison told Hendrix they were already dead. Hendrix reacted with shock. Both men died at 27 within a year of each other. The legend has taken on additional weight as the 27 Club expanded to include Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. Each death added to the mythology, and Morrison's prophecy to Hendrix became evidence that some artists know their fates, that early death is part of the deal for genius, that 27 is when the bill comes due.